A profound and seismic shift is taking place within Russian society, a slow-burning crisis of confidence that now threatens to fundamentally alter the nation's trajectory. This is not a story of dramatic revolution in the streets, but of a grinding, pervasive exhaustion, a collective realization among millions of ordinary Russians that the promised stability and gradual improvement of living standards have been irrevocably traded for a future of isolation, impoverishment, and perpetual conflict. The social contract that has underpinned Vladimir Putin's long tenure, an unspoken agreement exchanging political acquiescence for economic security and a sense of restored national pride, is fracturing. The triggers are interconnected and relentless. A war with no visible end, an inflation crisis eroding purchasing power, a hollowed-out job market severed from the global economy, and a palpable sense of a declining quality of life. The result is a deep societal pessimism, a departure from fear or fervent patriotism into a resigned despair that is being quietly measured in opinion polls, economic data, and a new wave of emigration. This internal decay poses a more insidious, long-term threat to the Kremlin's authority than any external sanction or battlefield reversal, representing a failure to deliver on the core promises of Putinism itself. The economic reality facing Russian households is one of silent, sustained contraction. While the state has avoided a technical recession through massive, war-focused government spending, the lived experience for citizens is one of inflation that stubbornly outpaces wages. Official statistics, already viewed with skepticism by independent analysts, show inflation hovering in the high single digits, but real-world assessments suggest key commodity prices have soared far higher. The cost of basic foodstuffs, consumer goods, and imported items from electronics to automobiles has skyrocketed. This is the direct consequence of the Western sanctions regime, which, while not collapsing the economy, has successfully severed Russia from critical supply chains, advanced technology, and efficient logistics networks. Import substitution, a Kremlin mantra for a decade, has proven incapable of filling the gap with quality, affordable goods. A car that cost the equivalent of $20,000 before the war may now cost $40,000, if it is available at all. Spare parts for foreign-made machinery, essential for everything from agriculture to manufacturing, have become scarce and exorbitantly priced. This translates into a silent tax on every Russian, relentlessly diminishing their standard of living. Savings accounts, once a bedrock of security for the middle class, are being depleted to cover daily expenses as the value of the ruble remains volatile and susceptible to geopolitical shocks. Concurrently, the job market is undergoing a dangerous transformation. The exodus of over 1,000 international companies in the wake of the invasion, from McDonald's and IKEA to Renault and BP, did not just remove consumer options, it eliminated hundreds of thousands of high-quality, modern sector jobs. These were positions that often paid better wages, offered professional development, and connected Russian workers to global standards and practices. The sectors that are growing defense production, state security, and raw materials extraction are not equivalent replacements. They are often geographically concentrated, less efficient, and subject to the whims of state planning and military needs. For educated professionals in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, the career ladder has been snapped. Opportunities for advancement, for changing jobs within a dynamic market, have drastically narrowed. The brain drain that began with the initial mobilization orders has continued as a steady trickle of the most talented and mobile citizens, programmers, engineers, scientists. Academics seek futures abroad where their skills are valued and their prospects are not limited by a pariah state status. This hollows out the country's human capital, its potential for innovation, and its tax base, creating a downward spiral of diminishing competitiveness. The quality of life decline extends far beyond economics into the social and cultural fabric. Russia has become a culturally isolated country. Access to global social media platforms, international news outlets, and even foreign entertainment has been systematically restricted or banned. The state has erected a digital iron curtain, promoting clunky domestic alternatives that lack the functionality and connectivity of the global internet. For a population that had grown accustomed to a connected world, this is a profound loss, a forced provincialism. Travel abroad has become exponentially more difficult and expensive due to closed airspace, severed banking links, and the logistical nightmare of obtaining visas to the few countries still welcoming Russian tourists. The once common dream of a European holiday or an education for one's children in the West is now out of reach for all but the wealthiest or most well-connected. Even domestic travel and services have degraded as airlines struggle without spare parts, and investment in infrastructure and non-military public projects grinds to a halt. The sense of being trapped, both physically and informationally, within a country that is moving backward is a powerful psychological burden, particularly on the urban middle class that benefited most from the globalization of the Putin era's first 2 decades. Historically, the Russian state has relied on a combination of nationalist mobilization and the provision of basic stability to maintain public compliance during times of hardship. The current moment tests this model to its limits. The nationalist fervor that state media tirelessly stokes is resonant with a core segment of the population, but evidence suggests it is failing to galvanize the broader society needed to sustain a long-term costly war. The historical parallel is not 1941, the Great Patriotic War against a Nazi invasion that unified the nation in existential struggle, but rather the later years of the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s, a distant, confusing conflict that brought only casualties, economic strain, and a growing sense of futility. The Kremlin's narrative of fighting a proxy war against NATO, while effective for some, rings hollow for others who see their sons returning in coffins from Ukrainian towns with Slavic names and no obvious threat to Russian territory. This disconnect allows the daily irritants of inflation and isolation to fester, untempered by a unifying sense of patriotic purpose. The social consequence is a new kind of apathy, not the political apathy of the past, but a weary, pessimistic detachment from the state's grand projects, a focus on sheer personal and family survival. Part 2. Politically, the Kremlin faces the delicate task of managing this rising tide of discontent without acknowledging its existence. The apparatus of repression remains formidable, swiftly dismantling any overt protest or organized political opposition. Yet the current threat is less about street demonstrations and more about a passive, sullen withdrawal of consent, a refusal to believe in the state's narrative or participate in its performative politics. Voter turnout and claimed support in managed elections may remain high due to administrative leverage and a lack of alternatives, but the genuine enthusiasm that once accompanied projects like the annexation of Crimea has evaporated. The political implication is a narrowing of the regime's base, forcing it to rely increasingly on the loyalty of coercive institutions, the military, the National Guard, the FSB, and on the passive acceptance of a population that feels it has no other choice. This creates a brittle form of stability. The regime's legitimacy, which had long been derived from a combination of economic performance and national prestige, is now underpinned primarily by fear and the absence of a visible alternative. However, as the economic pain deepens and the war's costs become more personal for more families, the calculus of fear versus grievance can shift. The potential for flashpoints remains, particularly around localized issues, like the handling of soldiers' casualties, pension reforms, or drastic cuts to regional subsidies. Internationally, the image of a Russia buckling under internal socio-economic strain is reshaping geopolitical calculations. For Western allies supporting Ukraine, the domestic Russian crisis is a strategic validation of the sanctions policy. It demonstrates that the economic costs of the war can be internalized within Russia, degrading its long-term capacity to wage war and potentially sapping the political will to continue. However, there is no sense of triumphalism in Western capitals, only grim recognition of a dangerous phase. A cornered, unstable Russia is viewed as potentially more unpredictable and reckless. The focus of international policy remains on strengthening Ukraine's defensive and offensive capabilities to capitalize on Russian weaknesses while maintaining clear lines of communication to manage escalation risks. For non-aligned nations in the global south, Russia's internal struggles present a dilemma. While many have benefited from buying discounted Russian energy and have refused to join sanctions, the spectacle of a major power visibly declining in prosperity and global influence serves as a cautionary tale. It may make them more hesitant to deepen strategic alliances with Moscow, seeing it as a partner with diminishing returns and increasing baggage. For China, Russia's decline solidifies its position as the senior partner in the relationship, allowing Beijing to extract more favorable terms in trade and diplomatic support, while simultaneously worrying about the stability of its northern neighbor. Expert analysis from economists, sociologists, and political scientists converges on the view that Russia is entering a period of managed degradation. The state has the tools, capital controls, energy revenues, and security services to prevent a sudden, catastrophic collapse like the 1990s. But it lacks the ability to reverse the downward trends in living standards and technological development. The economy is being reconfigured into a simpler, more primitive form, a militarized supplier of raw materials to a limited set of non-Western clients. This model cannot generate the same level of wealth or complexity as Russia's pre-war economy. Sociologists point to the phenomenon of internal emigration, where citizens, unable to leave physically, disengage mentally from the state and its projects, focusing on private life and informal networks for survival. This erodes the social capital needed for any form of collective action, positive or negative, and leads to long-term societal stagnation. Political analysts note the Kremlin's dilemma. Any attempt to address the economic crisis seriously would require diverting resources from the war effort, potentially dooming its military ambitions, while continuing to prioritize the war guarantees further economic decline and social dissatisfaction. There is no easy policy exit. What happens next is not a matter of speculation, but of observing which of these entrenched trends accelerates. The immediate future points towards a consolidation of the current state, more censorship, greater economic autarky, and heightened pressure on any remaining dissent. The state will likely attempt to placate key constituencies, increasing pensions and wages for state workers and military personnel even if it fuels inflation, while the general population bears the brunt through reduced public services and degraded goods. The war's duration remains the single greatest variable. A protracted, frozen conflict locks Russia into its current isolation indefinitely, making the degradation permanent. A dramatic escalation, such as a new mass mobilization, would inject a fresh shock of trauma and economic disruption into society, potentially crossing a threshold of public tolerance that has not yet been breached. Alternatively, a negotiated ceasefire, however distant it seems, would not immediately lift sanctions or reverse brain drain, but could allow for a slow, painful stabilization at a much lower level of economic activity and global engagement. The global consequences of a diminished, inward-looking Russia are still unfolding. In security terms, it remains a nuclear-armed, paranoid state with a substantial conventional military, even if degraded. It will continue to pose a threat to its neighbors and seek to disrupt the Western-led international order, but its capacity for large-scale, complex offensive operations may be permanently reduced. Economically, the world has already adjusted to a large degree, finding alternative energy sources and supply chains. The longer-term impact is the loss of Russia as a major market and a contributor to global scientific and cultural exchange, a loss that impoverishes the world even as it isolates Russia. For the Russian people, the path ahead is one of adjustment to a new, poorer, normal, a quality of life that may resemble that of a middle-income resource state rather than an aspiring great power. The end of the war, whenever it comes, will not signal a return to 2021. The costs in lives, in economic potential, in human capital, and in national spirit have already been incurred and will define Russia for a generation or more. The story is no longer about whether the Russian people have had enough. That point has passed for many. The story now is about how they, and their government, learn to live with the consequences of that profound and collective enough.